Recording in progress.
Welcome, everybody. We are just getting started here for tonight's meeting. We're going to give a moment or two for folks to be able to come in and join the meeting. So please sit tight and we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Hi, for those just coming in, we'll get started in a moment or two. We're going to allow folks another minute or so to join tonight's meeting. All right, well, let's get started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this community meeting of the City of Pacifica. We're here tonight to talk about an introduction to the housing element update. As we get started here, I want to go over a few points in regards to Zoom logistics. Not everybody's familiar, and so we want to make sure folks know how to participate at the various stages of the meeting tonight. First off, you'll see the mute button on the bottom left of your screen, hopefully. This is where you will make sure that your microphone is deactivated during most of the meeting. We ask that you do that, and we operate on the honor system and to be respectful of everybody and to minimize background noise for those other than the presenter. Next, you'll see also the participants meeting button. That's where you can potentially click and see, depending on your role in the meeting tonight, as to who is participating in tonight's meeting. And next to that, the chat function, which will enable you to chat with our moderator for tonight, which is Elizabeth Brooks. Hopefully you'll see her on your screen. In the chat options, if you do have any questions or comments as we go along tonight, please do select Elizabeth's name and send a brief message to her so she can see what's on your mind. And then lastly, reactions. Hopefully that's on your screen, and that'll allow you to provide an indication of what you think about a various piece of information or what have you. Now I'd like to introduce who is present tonight. I am honored to announce we are joined tonight by Mayor Pro Tem Tiger Jazz Big Stick and Councilmember Sue Beckmeyer of the Pacifica City Council. All of the council members are keenly interested in the housing element update, but unfortunately due to limitations on public meeting participation under the Brown Act, which is a state law governing public meetings, only 2 council members are allowed to participate in tonight's community meeting. We are also fortunate to have several commission and committee members, including planning commissioners, who ultimately will have the opportunity to weigh in on the housing element as part of the public process. In addition to those dignitaries, we do have Pacifica City staff. We have City Manager Kevin Woodhouse. We have Management Analyst 2 Elizabeth Brooks, Senior Planner Bonnie O'Connor, and me, Christian Murdoch. I'm the Planning Director for the City of Pacifica. And we are also joined by several folks from Baird and Driscoll Community Planning. Josh, would you and your team like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, though I seem to be having internet problems. Hi, everybody. I am going to switch rooms as I talk. I am Josh Abrams, a principal at Baird and Driscoll, and we help facilitate a countywide collaborative that's called 21 Elements, and it helps all the cities work together on housing policy. We don't advocate, but if we can help, if we can do things like this, that's why 21 Elements exists. Victor, do you want to go? And then Paul?
Yeah. Hi, I'm an associate with Baird and Driscoll, just helping out tonight.
Hi, Paul Penninger with Baird and Driscoll, also principal. Very glad to be here tonight to help with the facilitation of the breakout groups.
All right, thank you. So here is the overview of the agenda for tonight. These time indications are approximate. We want to make sure we have time to get through the information, and also in particular to provide enough time for our small group discussions later in the program for tonight. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to learn more about what a housing element is, housing trends in our area, and how we will plan for housing as part of the housing element update. This meeting is intended to provide you with an introduction to the housing element update that is just beginning, so you can learn more about what it is, the timeline, and housing trends, as well as how to participate in the process. And so we look forward also to hear more about your thoughts on housing needs and housing challenges in Pacifica. This is an introductory meeting, and so more meetings will follow. We are probably not going to answer all of your questions tonight, but we do hope to get you a baseline of information about what the city's doing and why with respect to the housing element update, and also let you know how you can stay engaged and participate in the additional forthcoming steps in the process. And so to that end, I've indicated on the screen here some ways that you can get signed up for our mailing list to make sure that you're informed with respect to future community meetings and public input opportunities. With that being said, particularly in this online environment, it's important for us to go over some ground rules. With one of the goals of the meeting being for us to hear from you, please only share your questions for us in the chat, as mentioned to Elizabeth Brooks, who's going to be collecting those. At various points where appropriate, depending on the questions received, we can stop and Elizabeth can pose the question, and then the various members of the city and supporting team can try to provide answers to those questions. It's also important to note that no decisions are being made tonight, and there will be plenty of discussions in the months to come with respect to the key policy decisions that need to be made as part of the housing element process. We understand there's a lot of different interests converging and convening at this meeting, so please be respectful of everyone. Don't interrupt other people when they're talking in the breakout rooms, and ensure that we can create space where everybody's comfortable sharing their opinions, observations, and experiences. We also want to make sure that if you're someone that normally, steps forward to talk in these types of community meeting forums, be mindful of that and make sure you step back and give others an opportunity to speak as well. We don't want anyone to dominate the conversation. It's important that we hear all voices. There's no right or wrong answers. And again, we want to give everyone an equal chance to speak. So now that you have an idea of who we are and why we're here, we would love to learn more about who you are. So please take a minute to fill out the poll that's on your screen. Be sure to scroll down and answer all the questions. We'll give you a minute or two to complete the poll. I want to reiterate, it's important that we reach as many people in our community as possible, which is why we're asking a bit about who you are. So that if we're missing anybody in our community, we can double down on our efforts to make sure we're reaching out to everybody. And of course, the poll is optional, so you can feel free to skip any questions you don't feel comfortable answering, or skip the whole thing if polls just aren't your thing. All right, I am seeing those responses streaming in here. Thank you for those that are completing the poll. All right, we are over halfway there in terms of responses, which is great, so thank you. If you haven't completed the poll questions yet, please go ahead and just take this last moment to do that. It is helpful, as I mentioned, for us to know who's in the room. All right, so we are at about 75%, so I'm going to go ahead and begin summarizing the responses. Elizabeth, did you want to share the results?
Absolutely, those should be coming up now. My apologies to those who were not able to see the poll.
All right, so we had 80% of those on the meeting participate, so thank you. The vast majority, 81% of responses to question number 1 indicated that they live in Pacifica. Looks like the next greatest response was that you're interested in San Mateo County housing issues at about 30%. And then a distribution of folks that work here, own a business, live and work here, or don't live here. Question number 2, how long have you lived here? More than half, more than 20 years. So a lot of longtime residents. The next greatest response was from those that haven't lived here very long at all, so 0 to 5 years. That's 20% of those that responded. And then pretty even split among 6 to 10 years, and I don't live in Pacifica. Question 3, what best describes your housing situation? So 82% of you indicated that you own your home, and 12% indicated that you rent, and then 6% other. Of the age responses, pretty even distribution, roughly a third each in 25 to 40 years old, 41 to 64, and 65 plus. And then in terms of race and ethnicity, we had 72% indicate white, 22% Asian, and 11% Hispanic or Latino. And then lastly, in terms of neighborhood of residency, not all neighborhoods represented in the poll. Some of the higher number of responses from Lindemar and also from Pacific Manor Edgemar, but we also do have folks from East or West Sharp Park, Valley Mar, Rockaway Beach, and Park Pacifica. So thanks again for participating. It's always helpful, as I mentioned, to know, and we will move on from there. We're now going to get into what a housing element is, what the update process is for the housing element, and some countywide trends related to housing. At this point, I'm going to ask Josh Abrams to please continue our conversation on this topic. And Josh, just indicate when you want me to advance the slides, please.
Great. Hi, everybody. Hi again. Thank you. So why don't you do the next slide? The very first question is, what is a housing element? It's basically a local housing plan to figure out the needs, the homes needed, and the needs of the people who live in every community. Communities, I think you know, cities don't build housing, but they do make the rules that shape what housing can be built and what types of housing and how much. And the housing element is essentially that. It looks at what are the rules and how can they change about housing. It includes policies and programs that address the needs for all types of housing. And it also includes looking specifically at those with special needs or developmental disabilities or large families, a handful of special needs categories. And it looks at solutions, broader solutions like how to preserve existing housing or how to get more affordable, new affordable housing. California law requires all cities to update their housing element every 8 years. The last one was 2015 to 2022. So this current cycle, the one we're talking about at this meeting, will guide housing from 2023 to 2031. The next slide. There's a bunch of parts to a housing element. You start by studying to look at existing conditions. You look at what conditions, what housing is like now and what the need is. You look at constraints or issues that will make housing in certain areas hard to develop. And you identify sites where it's possible to add new housing. You generally start from the old housing element, reviewing the goals and the policies and programs and figure out what changes, what new ones can be added. And then this cycle, especially, there's a new consideration for fair housing to address discrimination and segregation in housing and environmental justice too. And some of that segregation just happens without intention, and some of it is a legacy of the past where there really were.
Yes, I do.
The one
cabinet, you had your tea.
Can we mute the person who's... okay, great. Some of it was a legacy of the past when housing discrimination was actually allowed. And of course, the state requires that the part of the housing element is doing community engagement. So that's part of this process, as well as many more meetings where community members have an opportunity to talk about their needs and to shape the final plan. Would you do the next slide? So it all starts with the general plan. All cities have documents called general plans that's like their blueprint or their vision or their constitution for the city. It guides all of the decisions, from roads to sidewalks to parks and neighborhoods. The city of Pacifica updated a new general plan in July after more than 40 years since the last major update. So that's going to be, obviously that's going to be a really central guiding part of the housing element because a ton of work went into it. The next slide, please. but we're here in particular to talk about the housing element. And element's just a fancy word for a chapter of the general plan. So this is the housing chapter, which is, as I said, the plan for the homes that are needed in the community. It's a little different. One thing is it's a little different than the other chapters because this one is reviewed by the state and certified that it meets all of the detailed rules in state law. Next slide. And an important part of the housing element is the RHNA. It's RHNA, but it's pronounced RHNA. And it's a target number of how much housing cities need to plan for. Again, cities don't need to build that housing, but they need a plan for it. The California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, it calculates a total number needed for the whole Bay Area based on factors like job and economic growth and population and current unmet housing. And then the local association of governments, or ABAG, decides the share for each city or each town and each county through a very lengthy process that's now completed and decided that looks at where the jobs are and other factors like that. The RHNA is not the most important part of the plan. The policies and programs are a super important part because that really guides local actions. But where sites go, where new housing goes is a really important part. And that's all tied up in the RHNA. Next slide. I'm just going to say a few more words about the RHNA because we're going to come back to it later and ask your thoughts about what would make good sites for housing. The city of Pacifica received its final RHNA for the housing element in December 2021, and we're required to build 1,892 units across all income levels, which is a big increase from the 413 that was in the last housing element. But it's also consistent. All of the cities in the whole region, in the whole state, have higher housing targets for a variety of reasons, but mostly because we really know that we need more housing for a variety of reasons that we'll actually talk to you about what's going on for you. But we know there's a housing shortage. So there's higher targets across the entire state. You can see on the next slide, you can see we broke out the housing targets by income level. And we just also showed San Mateo County and the Bay Area to give you a sense of comparison. So about half of the units have to be identified for people who are low or very low income. Again, the state accepts that there might not be enough resources to build all those units, but cities have to do everything they can, have to make a really diligent effort to make that possible. But if it doesn't happen, that is okay. And then you see the San Mateo County has a 48,000 and the Bay Area has a 442,000. I think that's just the point there is everyone's doing their share. Everyone's making hard decisions about where new housing should go. Okay, next slide. A little about the process. Based on your input over the coming months and studies and data, policies and programs will be developed to respond to the housing needs. And this all goes into the draft housing element. Next slide. And after more public input, public hearings, and review by the state, it becomes a final draft. The final draft gets adopted by usually first Planning Commission and then City Council, and it's certified by the state as being in compliance or substantially meeting all of the state requirements. Next slide. It's then part of the general plan, which informs housing policy and is a legally binding document. Next slide. And its goal will be to support the creation and preservation of the amount and types of housing that's needed by the community. As much as there are state rules, it really is a local document, and there's a ton of opportunity to really make it meaningful for the local community. Okay, next slide. The process typically looks like this. Throughout the rest of this year and the first part of 2023, there'll be a lot of community outreach. City staff and consultants have already started work on the required analysis of existing conditions in Pacifica, which will be combined with your input as well as state law requirements. The city estimates a draft will be released during early spring 2023 for public review, followed by an initial review by the state. after state review, there'll be a public hearings with the Planning Commission and Council in late spring 2023, and then adoption. I know that's a lot to digest. I promise you, we're going to talk less very soon. That's just this first part of the meeting. We want to make sure everyone it has a similar base of knowledge, but pretty soon we're going to open it up. But I just want to open it up for questions at this point. If you would just chat them to Elizabeth. Elizabeth Brooks, she has moderator next to her name. If you have any questions, and we can spend a few minutes about the overall process or timeline, we can spend a few minutes answering them.
We have a request to show the RENA numbers again, and a question as to if we know how many Half Moon Bay was required to do. I don't have that information handy, but I can respond later.
Yeah, I can. If you pull that up, I can pull up the Half Moon Bay number too.
Yeah, I will go back to that table in just a moment here. And then there is another slide later that shows it in a slightly different visual form, which might be helpful for some folks.
Half Moon Bay had 480 as their target number. They are a little further, probably their number is lower because they're a little further from job centers. And also, I think their population's a little lower, but I want to confirm that. Yeah, actually their population's closer to a third of Pacifica's. So that's why they have a lower number.
What category would a teacher's salary put them in?
That's a great question. So we use these categories because funding is attached to them. And what most people think of as low, the labels aren't intuitive, is what I'm trying to say, particularly because it's all tied to what incomes are in the county, and incomes are really high in San Mateo County. I would guess a teacher would probably typically fall into the low income category. It depends on their household size, if they have kids or another earner, but I'm guessing they probably would fall into the low, maybe very low income. They probably fall into low or very low if they're a single earner household.
And there is a slide later in the presentation that shows some example salaries and respective to the income levels as well as affordability for housing.
Great.
Beginning teachers make around $71,000 a year in San Mateo County, which would put them for a one-person household in the low part of the spectrum.
Yeah, a couple of questions relating to the timeline that we need to have the housing element submitted in January, but it won't be completed till late spring. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure, happy to. So we recognize that we had a later start than many other jurisdictions in the area. That was driven primarily by the ongoing work to do the comprehensive general plan update that we mentioned. And so we acknowledge that and have identified the most ambitious timeline that we reasonably can to hopefully complete the work. There is a grace period provided by the state beyond the January adoption deadline. And so we will be using that grace period and potentially going beyond that, unfortunately. But that remains to be seen. We are doing all we can to timely complete the housing element update process.
And if it makes anyone feel anybody better, Southern California is a year ahead of Northern California or the Bay Area in their deadline. So they're about a year past their deadline, and only about a quarter of them have had their housing element certified.
Who's responsible for the supporting infrastructure, such as highway improvements to support additional housing?
So those types of improvements are typically identified when a specific project is known and what those particular impacts would be from that project. And so most often the burden will fall on a particular developer. In some cases where they may be required to do broader improvements that have more impact than just for their development, sometimes the city will be able to enter into some sort of cost share with a developer or enter into some other type of reimbursement agreement so that future development that relies on that improvement or those improvements will also pay their fair share. So it's not a simple answer, and it really depends on the circumstances. Why don't we take one more question? And just a reminder to chat to Elizabeth Brooks, who's the moderator collecting the input for the questions today.
I'm going to look through. We have a few more. I just want to see if there's a couple that might be along the same lines. We're taking note of all your questions, and we'll respond after the meeting if we don't get to them in the meeting.
And then I did receive one question here. I understand this RHNA cycle will have a lot more state oversight and critical review. Many cities have submitted their draft elements already. What type of major issues are you seeing in other cities? Josh, do you mind fielding that one, since you do work with a number of other jurisdictions?
Yeah, in terms of state review, the issues we're seeing is a couple of things. One of them is this fair housing, making sure we're not putting more concentrating lower income housing in certain neighborhoods, make sure it's spread throughout all neighborhoods. So fair housing concerns are one of the most common ones. The other one is a lot of cities are getting in trouble because they have vague housing plans, action plans. They don't have a lot of commitments. So the state really wants to see a lot of commitments in the housing plans. I would say those are the two. And there's a lot of like little small comments, like you don't have enough data about this, but they're pretty easy to address without substantial changes. And it looks like maybe, did I slip over a slide, go over a slide, or did I meant to say, that one of the things with the housing choice is a couple of things, and I think I went past this slide, but there is a lot of scrutiny about where the sites are going and making sure, sorry, this is a really big one, making sure, answering your question, there's enough, the sites you identify for new housing are really real sites. They're not sites that are never going to redevelop, or sites that aren't good for housing. So that's one of the things you see a lot of comments on. Making sure that sites aren't increasing segregation is another thing that there's a lot of comments on. Okay.
Thank you for the great questions. So I think we are going to move on at this point to the next slide. And Josh, I think you're going to carry us through a bit further before we switch back. Great. I'm going to talk a little about the housing trends. I think the point here, though, is these are what we saw. These are what the data shows, but we actually really want to hear from people about what you think are the important trends. And I think obviously the bigger picture context is that the Bay Area is a great place to live in a lot of ways. A lot of people, myself included, really like living here. But throughout the region in San Mateo County, there's just not enough housing for all income levels, particularly for that low or moderate income people. And we've seen prices really go up a lot. This has a lot to do with there being a lot of new jobs, particularly closer in the Bay, on the Bay side. We have a really strong economy, and we have for decades, and that's created a ton of demand. It's also all the other amenities too that are in and around the community. While some communities have more jobs, some have less. Overall, we haven't built enough housing for the past 30 years to have a balance for jobs and housing. Since 2010, the county has added over 100,000 jobs, but only 10,000 homes. That's one trend. I think also, additionally, the population is growing naturally with people living longer. By naturally, we mean births compared to deaths, people living longer and children growing up and wanting to move out. So that's another thing that drives the housing need. So it's people moving in, as well as this thing that's natural increase, or children growing up and needing their own homes. So this means that there's more housing is needed to keep things in balance. So there are homes to ensure that there's enough homes to meet the needs. It's obviously much easier to meet the needs of market rate housing because developers build it. And for those who can afford it, it's much more complicated when we're talking about low or moderate income housing. And that's where you really need well-crafted policies or programs to think about how you can get that housing built, or where you can find the financial subsidies to get it built. Okay, next slide. It's
obviously a key trend, as I'm saying, is that it's known as an expensive place to live. While there are obviously a lot of good jobs, some are making a lot more than others, and wages haven't kept up with the cost of housing. A lot of people are spending more than 30% of their income on rent, which is considered cost burdened, or that they're spending too much. In fact, 1 of 4 renters spends more than 50% of their income on rent. And while rents have declined during COVID, renters have already paying a lot, and there's just been very little relief. Also, inflation and prices elsewhere in the economy has squeezed everybody's budget, which is most impactful for those with lower incomes. One other, I think, important trend is we rely on essential workers. For teachers or nurses. For every 6 low-wage jobs in San Mateo County, and a low-wage job is considered making $20 an hour, we only have one such home that a worker can really afford. Okay, next slide. So going back a little to the earlier question, let's look at what those categories of low or moderate income mean. The median income means the middle spot where between the lowest and highest wages, where there's an equal number of people who make more or less than that. And the median income in San Mateo County for a single person is about $121,000. If you're a grocery store clerk or a barista making minimum wage, about $15 an hour, you'll make $29,000 a year based on a 40-hour work week. So that would be considered extremely low income because it's less than 30% of that median wage, that typical wage. And even with the low assumed cost of a couple $2,000 per month, which it's hard to get Pacifica specific data, but that's based on Daly City. It most likely, regardless sorry to say this, it would be really hard if you're making that minimum wage or even close to it to find housing. And realistically, you might even be spending upwards of 3/4 of your income on rent. If you're a school administrator or a social worker, even with an hourly wage of $45 an hour and a salary of $86,000 a year, you'd still be defined as low income in San Mateo County, because that's pegged at 80% of the area median income. Okay, next slide. So what are the impacts? Overall, people are paying too much of their income on housing. This has resulted in overcrowding or people living with more roommates or family members their home can hold. This can also mean people stay in safe or unhealthy conditions because they have no other option. People are also moving further away to places with more affordable rents and home prices, resulting in longer commutes to work. With more workers we depend on moving away due to high costs. We have more traffic and greater pollution and greenhouse gases. Sometimes people can no longer make their direct or indirect costs of traveling, work, and they move outside of the area. Now I'm going to turn it over back to Pacifica staff to talk a little about some of the additional information on City of Pacifica specific trends.
Thanks so much, Josh, for giving us that overview of housing trends and affordability trends for San Mateo County. We're going to zoom in now onto our community, the City of Pacifica. Pacifica has experienced many of the trends discussed for the county overall. The cost of housing has affected our community, with people financially burdened by housing or forced to leave the community due to housing costs and lack of availability of housing they can afford. We also have many older residents with special housing needs, which presents unique challenges to either provide housing or ensure that they can stay within their housing. I want to talk a moment about Home for All. Looking at the names, many of you were part of that process back in 2019 when the city held 2 community conversations to learn more about what our residents were experiencing in terms of access to housing and housing affordability. We received tremendous interest and input in the process. Some of the key takeaways were that the lack of quality housing that they could afford was having a direct negative impact on their lives and the lives of their family and friends. Several attendees noted that their children had already moved elsewhere, while others expressed concern that their children would not be able to return to Pacifica due to the cost of housing. Others voiced concern about the loss of longtime neighbors, as well as teachers from local schools and the difficulty of keeping small business employees and owners from being pushed out. The meetings also helped to establish broad shared community values on housing, which included that many community members said they valued Pacifica's diverse population and the strong sense of community. Residents wanted Pacifica to be a community with economic, racial, and age diversity. They wanted Pacifica to be a place where families with young children can happily coexist with seniors aging in place. And many people indicated they wanted to avoid Pacifica becoming a city that is only affordable to upper income families or certain age groups. We are going to post the slides from today's meeting after we wrap up later on the planpacifica.org webpage, but I want you to notice at the bottom of this slide that we have links to the meeting number 1 and meeting number 2 reports from those Home for All sessions, which provide a lot of helpful background and additional information. So what do we do about the problem? We think the answer is planning for the housing needs of everyone at all phases of life. Pacifica has always been a great place to live and raise a family, which is why so many people have moved here over the years, and now so many are growing old here. With more people 55 and over than there were 10 or 20 years ago, we also need to address simultaneously how to continue supporting our seniors as they get older so they can stay in their homes and our community, while also making sure young families have the opportunity to find housing here and that they don't have to move out because they can't find the housing that they want and need. So ultimately, this housing element update provides an opportunity to develop policies and programs responding to all the phases of life for our community members that they're going to experience. We think the housing element update process will make it possible for housing for more diverse housing choices, which in the future can mean that your children or grandchildren can stay in Pacifica where they grew up. Young families, single parents, and large families will be able to find starter homes. All the people we depend on in our communities, like teachers, firefighters, healthcare, and other essential workers, can live closer to their jobs without long commutes, which are unhealthy for them and their families, and that impact the environment. And that older adults can stay in their homes or communities as they age. And just generally speaking, community members across all incomes can find housing in Pacifica. And so we've shared what we've heard from others, in the region, as well as at earlier meetings on housing in Pacifica. Now we'd like you to complete the poll that's on your screen to share some of your thoughts about the most pressing housing needs in Pacifica. So we have launched that poll. I would ask that you all take a moment. Again, reminder to please scroll down and make sure you review all the options and select the top 3 that resonate with you in terms of the most pressing housing needs in Pacifica. And I encourage everyone to participate. As mentioned earlier in the first poll, it really does give us helpful feedback on the types of topics that are resonating with you, our community, on these really important issues. So we will provide just another minute. Hopefully everyone that wants to can participate. We just cracked 50%, which is great. And I'm seeing the trends really starting to shape up in these answers, which is really instructive.
If you're not able to see the poll, I might suggest escaping full screen mode by pressing escape on your computer, or by going to the top right of your screen and changing your view mode. Hopefully that makes the poll visible for you.
In light of that, we'll wait just a few more seconds in case any folks were having some technical difficulties seeing the poll. We are just about at 80% response, and the activity seems to have dropped off a little bit. We'll just give a few more seconds. All right, why don't we go ahead and end the poll? We've hit 80% participation. And so there were a range of responses. There were selections across all of these. I think that reflects that there are a lot of housing needs and priorities in Pacifica. The greatest response, 52% of respondents, selected housing for working families, i.e. those of moderate income, but not quote unquote low income. The next greatest looks like it was a 48% response for affordable housing, which is nonprofit affordable housing developers, housing units they create as specific intentional affordable housing developments. And then there were a couple other strong responses, an even split between rental housing at a variety of price ranges and housing for essential employees in the community. And then, a division across a number of other responses. So thank you, everybody that participated in that poll. So as we talked about, I think it's our sense, that our job is to plan for more housing for all different types of community needs and housing types. And so what does that mean for the purposes of this particular housing element update? Earlier, we introduced the concept of the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA. One of the main tasks for this housing element update is to identify sites in Pacifica where at least 1,892 housing units can be constructed. The graphic on the screen shows how Pacifica's RHNA for this housing element update is not only much higher than the RHNA in the previous update, but also includes a greater share of the units for persons with lower incomes. The needs to plan for a larger share of housing units for lower income levels will have an effect on the strategies available to the city to accomplish its planning. For example, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, the magic number of 30 is very important for this purpose. What that means is 30 units per acre, which is the minimum density for areas identified for affordable housing development in the housing element. That's higher than the density of development that has occurred in Pacifica since perhaps the 1970s and earlier. And so it really is going to require us to, I think, reimagine the types of development that we're going to be seeing constructed and approved in our community. Then there's the concept as part of the RHNA planning process and sites identification of no net loss. That is a provision in state law, and it provides that if a site identified in the housing element is developed at a lower density than projected, the city must demonstrate that sufficient sites remain elsewhere in the city for the respective income level or levels stated for that site in the housing element. And so what that means as a result, many cities are planning for an additional 20% or more on top of their RHNA to avoid running afoul of the no net loss provisions in state law, which could mean planning for an additional 300 to 400 units on top of our RHNA. The good news is that we're not starting from scratch in terms of planning for housing for the housing element update. As mentioned earlier, the city adopted a comprehensive general plan update known as the 2040 General Plan in July of this year. The general plan update includes a number of new land use designations and higher densities in some existing land use designations that will provide a basic set of tools for evaluating options for site identification in the housing element update. City staff is still analyzing the impact of the general plan update on our ability to comply with the RHNA in this housing element update process. And our preliminary analysis indicates that we have a good head start already baked into the general plan. With that said, there is still going to be a heavy lift ahead for our community to identify many more potential housing sites for future general plan amendments and rezoning as part of the housing element update process. More information on that process and the options available for our community to satisfy our RHNA obligations will be the focus of the community meetings planned for late next month. The October community meetings will also discuss city policies and programs that relate to housing development and how the city can improve those policies and programs to be more supportive of housing development. And so we appreciate your patience and attention thus far to the background information that we presented in tonight's meeting. We hope you found it helpful in order to get a general understanding of what a housing element is and why the city is updating the housing element, as well as some of the key obligations the city is going to have as part of that process. Now we're going to break into smaller groups where we'll ask you 3 questions about rezoning and what your concerns may be related to that process, what values or priorities should drive our rezoning decisions, and what you think is standing in the way of new housing in Pacifica, as well as how we might address those challenges. Each group will have 2 facilitators from the city team who will guide you through the questions and capture your feedback. We've set aside about 25 minutes for these small group discussions, after which we will return to the full group and the facilitators from each group will summarize some of the key points from their respective groups. As mentioned earlier, we encourage everybody to participate because your input is valuable to us and to this housing element update process. We also want to remind you of the ground rules and to be respectful of everybody and all viewpoints that are expressed. So please allow us a moment to get the breakout groups set up, and we look forward to having our individual discussions.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi. Feel free to unmute. Feel free to show your face. If you don't know my face, my name is Elizabeth, and I'm so happy to be with you tonight. I'm so glad you joined us. We're looking very much forward to hearing your thoughts tonight. Hopefully everyone feels comfortable speaking. If not, I might just kick things off by picking on one of you to get started. But let's just dive in with our first question here. One of my colleagues here is going to be taking notes on everything we say tonight. As we look to rezone, what are your concerns?
Are we talking rezoning Pacifica, or are we talking about areas where it's going to be built out?
Everything will be in the confines of the Pacifica jurisdiction. And so we're talking about rezoning within Pacifica. There may be some few instances where that is land that's currently vacant and not zoned for that, but in most cases it will be rezoning what already exists.
And how is that going to affect Pacifica if we rezone it? Maybe that's my confusion with rezoning. What's the point of rezoning, and how is that going to affect Pacifica?
That's what we're here to talk about.
Oh, okay.
So the effect of rezoning will be that in some areas that will increase the amount of housing units that could potentially be built there. And that affects Pacifica in so many number of ways. And that's what we're hoping to hear from you tonight. What are your concerns as we look at that? Thank you, Josh. Go ahead.
Yeah, let's piggyback on that question a little bit. So, for example, I live in the Sharp Park area, and it's already quite dense. And it's a mixture of single family homes and then kind of duplexes and fourplexes that are rental kind of units. Would changes be affecting Sharp Park area?
Potentially.
Potentially. So it's already quite dense. So I'm kind of curious about, what would be proposed there. The main street, I think, could be well developed, and you could actually have more. I think there's a modern architectural name for it, but storefronts with apartments above them. Many communities along the coast do that kind of stuff. But my major concern is that as we develop and as we add in more homes, that we're maintaining the good value and nice community that we've built. That's a concern. I see actually quite a few where there are just people kind of slumlording, and there's a lot of that going on. And so that's I think that's moving in the wrong direction to get more people into the community, and it's an issue. So I kind of want to open that issue up a little bit.
Yes, thank you for sharing.
Josh, are you aware of the Sharp Park specific plan that the council just approved in the last month? Because that rezoned Sharp Park to 4 or 5 stories along Palmetto and along Francisco. So they're already planning for denser housing above commercial in those areas.
That's good. I'm always kind of pro new development, make new things, make them nice, make them fitting for the community. My concern is that a lot of times, you know, real estate is so expensive here. Many people either inherited a home or they've lived in it for so many years. They don't put any effort into maintaining it. And so that's a concern. I've seen a lot of kind of wiggling around trying to build, you know, a lot of trailers actually is an issue. I'd rather people create real actual ADUs and have ADU programs to double their housing. There's a great program, which actually we qualified for, which was wonderful, where the state of California will grant you $40,000 to establish an ADU. There are things like that which the community could really take advantage of, and so that you're actually building nice things to get higher density, either having family members kind of live in there as they age. That's one of the things we're interested in, or actually having more family members, just more room on your property.
If I can piggyback on, oh, I'm so sorry, Speaker. We had a write-in comment that sort of can fit right against that, and I wanted to give her a chance to speak up. She's not able to unmute. She mentioned her concerns are lack of fire maps and flood maps in the general plan, helping drive the rezoning. Residential 1 zones being turned into residential 3 zones, meaning hotels, i.e. 6+ rooms, could be built in an area where she intentionally purchased a single family zoning. Other concerns would be along the lines of lack of emergency routes out of the community south of Sharp Park Road. And I mentioned that here just because we're giving one perspective of in favor of building up communities. I'm done now. Thank you. Please, I didn't mean to speak over the speaker.
Hi, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, I am 100% against any more building in Pacifica. The reasons for, I don't want our city to look like Daly City or San Francisco. The question I have is, everyone on your side and your end are saying affordable housing. What is affordable housing? Give me a dollar amount. In Lindemar, houses go between $1 million to $1.3 million. Anyone that buys a piece of property in Lindemar, their mortgage is going to be between $4,000 and $5,000 a month. What is affordable housing? I need a dollar amount on this, not just something that people can live in that they can afford. But do you have it a dollar amount?
If you're asking me, I don't have a dollar amount I can share in this meeting. It's a more complicated answer than that, and not one I have myself, but I'm happy to take note of your question, and we can respond to that, hopefully either in the larger meeting or after the meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Does anyone else want to share their concerns about?
The city owns, like some of the abandoned school sites are now used for some maybe they can be considered. I don't know. There's a possibility there.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. And so what I'm hearing from you is that the design of these developments is going to be very important to you. You know, big boxy development, multi-story, boxy buildings is something it's a factor of concern for you in terms of projects.
And some of these micro homes that they're talking about, that might be acceptable in certain areas, like they're having in here, actually to some in Sharp Park right now. Do you think that would answer the question? And maybe the Habitat for Humanity that they have in Sharp Park near the golf course, that's an excellent development. And I think it's affordable.
Okay, yeah, we can certainly look at that. And I think, again, that particular building, if I'm thinking of the right one, it's a well-designed building. And so it seems like maybe that helps it settle into the surroundings. Sherry, why don't you go ahead, please?
So when I get worried about what decisions being made, I think there are so many factors that have to be considered. And sometimes we get focused on one thing like traffic or space or beauty, or just and somehow we have to all sort of bigger picture view things. And I think one of the things for example, when I saw, potential heights of buildings, but I recently visited Vancouver, and I just noticed how far ahead of us, of the Bay Area, they are in terms of being more ecological and in tune with their environment. And one of the things they have is these huge buildings. They have built forever in housing in a large way, but they have also included space for people to have life in their homes and out of their homes. And, to just build a larger building with more units, you put people in boxes, and that's not enough for, that it has to be in conjunction with their environment. So it's just something that I didn't think about before. I started thinking about when the Planning Commission was talking about we have to have a 5-year plan and a 20-year plan, but anything that we build, hopefully is going to be here in 100 years, right? So thinking short-term and long-term, and having to shift our mindsets, because I love Pacifica for the open space. But how we use our space that we're using, I think we have to think differently.
Yeah, it's certainly a complex planning challenge. I think some of what you said relates to Ken's concerns about appropriate design. And then also, I think generally trying to make sure the buildings relate to their environment, right? Which we have a lot of beautiful natural amenities that we need to make sure we don't lose sight of. Dave, you raised your hand. Do you have a brief add-on? Because I want to shift to the next question.
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry. I just kind of what Ken was saying about the, so I know that keeping the environment and everything of the smaller city feel and everything else. And I think the ADUs and thing really grasp a lot of that. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, Christian, but your department is actually a lot of roadblocks. And it's really, it hurts because smaller landlords and things like that, this is actually something they can do and something they can do to help the housing. And there's been a lot of roadblocks, and it's just kind of unfortunate. So I'm hoping you guys can open your eyes a little bit more, and let's try and think outside the box a little bit and try and grasp that.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate the feedback, Dave. We've approved a lot of ADUs in the last couple of years. So if you're encountering issues, or those that are encountering issues, reach out to me. I'd like to know about it, because I feel like we're doing what we can to try to make the process efficient. But ADUs are certainly part of the solution. You'll hear us talk more about that when we get to the more focused RHNA planning and subsequent community outreach. It's an important, but ultimately, due to requirements in state law, it's going to be a relatively small share of our allowable solution for our RHNA moving forward. Great input on question 1. Let's go ahead and shift into question 2, which we started to get into a little bit. Anyways, a lot of these have overlap. What values or priorities should drive our rezoning decisions? Mark, you haven't weighed in yet. Do you want to get us started, please?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, of course. So what values or priorities should drive our rezoning decisions? And then what this means is in the context of doing rezoning to accomplish our RHNA, right? The 2,000 units, give or take, that the city has to plan for in this housing element update. What values or priorities should drive that?
Well, I think what was stated earlier, that preserve the hillsides but definitely more than anything else, stay away from the environmentally sensitive areas. I think that's ends up in being a big fight and an extended period of time. And I think the housing has to come quickly if Pacific is going to have workers and teachers, and teachers are workers, but those kinds of things. So.
Yeah, well, thank you. So environmental sensitivity and avoiding sensitive environmental habitats sounds like a value that you're saying should be very important in our planning process.
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, I would say build it in a golf course. That's the ideal spot, but I suppose that won't go over well.
Well, that would seem to be one of the environmentally sensitive areas, in my opinion.
Well, just on the back 9 then.
Okay. All right, we have a dial-in participant. Last 4 of the phone number 0644. Would you like to weigh in and share what your values or priorities should be for our rezoning decision?
Is that 06? That's me. Yes, I would.
That's
love
you.
to.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Do you mind just sharing your first name so we can know what to call you?
It's Robin in Sharp Park.
Hi, Robin.
Hi.
Glad you can join us.
Thank you. Thanks for. I didn't know I could do this. I was just listening. So, what I would really like to know is that can we have something that more or less sort of codifies that we want to protect the housing that we have, because I live in West Sharp Park and I have neighbors in also Fairway Park, and we're extremely concerned. I know that, we're talking about environmentally sensitive areas, and I agree with that. The beach is an environmentally insensitive area, and we care about the beach. People wouldn't live out here if we didn't care about it. I raised my children on this beach, walking our pet dogs and being sensitive to the environment and cleaning. So, but it would be nice to know that what we would like to do first is allow us to protect or from threat the housing that we have. And of course, I'm talking about Sharp Park. I'm talking about Fairway Park, because there's, I guess you could call it a lot of housing insecurity for those of us that live out there now, because for quite a long time, we've been hearing that people really want to just manage retreat the neighborhood. And that's an awful lot of housing that would be lost as a result of it. When I participated in a hearing with the Coastal Commission back in 2017, and at that time, staff was projecting that, for instance, the loss of the berm at the golf course could represent in potential future flooding of 3,000 to 4,000 properties, residences, and businesses in the area there. That's quite a big loss of housing alone. So I think it's very, very important that, that out of this housing element, and you can correct me and tell me if it's already been said, I apologize if it has, Christian, that we really need to make sure that we go there and say that the housing that we do have does deserve to be protected from any threat whatsoever.
Thanks, Robin. I think we're going to have to end it there to make sure other folks have a chance. But I think your value of protecting what we have is really important. It's really hard to build new housing, right? And so the easiest thing to do in the first instance is to make sure we're not losing housing. And so I think that is an important value to consider. Preservation of housing is one of the key components we have to analyze in the housing element. And so there will be a role for considering that and making sure perhaps the natural hazard component of preservation is also represented as a value, as you mentioned. Eamon,
is just the long, lengthy approvals process. I mean, typical housing can take, 4 to 10 years to develop just to get the approvals in many cities in the Bay Area. And I know, back east, they have a thing that's called as of right. So if the housing, a plot of land, let's say it's zoned for 50 units, developer can come in there, build the 50 units so long as they're within the setbacks and the height limits, and the shadowing, setbacks and that sort of thing, without having to go through a planning approval. They just go straight to the building department, submit their plans, and they're ready to go. So I'd like to see Pacifica do the same thing. Is once we, put all the effort in to figure out where all this housing can go through our housing element, zone it that way, then any developer can come and, build without having to go through planning commission. That would save, a lot of time. So I think, what we're trying to do right now is the right first step. But, we got to stop, spot zoning stuff and requiring every little project to go through planning commission. Thank you.
Thanks, Rami. Suzanne, thanks for raising your hand.
That's okay. I would like to suggest that we create a tool to help us to be more competitive to attract housing preservation and nonprofit contractors. And that tool would be a dedicated housing fund that might have some funding that comes in on a regular basis in ways that other communities have created them, through a vacancy fee and through a title transfer fee. And if we had that money, we would be much more able to attract nonprofit contractors as well as folks like HIP Housing who do housing preservation.
Yeah, thank you. Robert or Helen or Ken? I don't think we've, or Anne, we haven't heard from any of you yet. Please feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like to add something.
This is Helen. I'm actually have to go because I can't work overtime, so I have to. So I just put in my schedule. I think that is this event an hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours?
So we are probably going to talk for another 7 minutes or so, and then we'll close that. We'll join the rest of everybody and close out.
Okay. For an hour and a half, though.
Okay, I'm just here. So I'm just here to listen.
Okay.
I don't really have anything to say. Thank you.
Okay. Well, know that you're welcome to contribute whenever you feel. Ken, I see you unmuted. Do you want to go ahead?
I just got bounced out of the session with Christian Murdoch. So what's the question maybe?
The question that we're on is what, no, I'm sorry. We are on question 2, which is, what do you think is standing in the way of new housing and how do we address those challenges?
I understand what Remy was saying, but I kind of feel that for the time being, the Planning Commission should be, I was a former planning commissioner for about 5 years back in the 1990s, ancient times. But I think the Planning Commission is a vital tool that would help place certain ADUs, for instance, or a massive housing that might be considered. So they should be involved in whether it's a single unit or a multiple unit, I think they should be involved.
Okay.
In the decision.
Thank you.
Hey, Bonnie, this is Ramy. I'd like to respond to that. I was a planning commissioner too on Pacifica, and I think the planning commission is, useful when somebody wants to try to, do a variance or something that's outside the zoning box, and developers are welcome to do that. But that's when the planning commissioner and the planning staff can spend the time to look at it and see if that's appropriate. But to run a project that is within the zoning envelope through planning is just a waste of everybody's time. And it just holds up the development. It makes it a lot more expensive for the developers to build. So I, respectfully disagree with that. And, as a planning commissioner, I, sure hated to waste time on projects that I didn't think should have came in front of the planning commission. And we need to look at the ones that, if a developer wants to upzone a lot or, get a variance to put more units, that's the useful thing the planning commission and planning staff need to look at. Thank you.
Great, Remy. All right. Well, last call for comments on this question. We're running low on time, so I'm going to encourage us to move to the next question unless someone else wants to speak to this one. No? Okay, our final question is, what values or priorities should drive our rezoning decision? What values or priorities should drive our rezoning decisions? Suzanne, please go ahead.
I'm just going to simply say that we haven't built low-income housing in over 3 decades, and it's really an incredible need. So we truly need to figure out how we can create low-income housing. And since we have none, and there are people who are in desperate need, consider how to create interim housing for people to have while they're waiting for the permanent setting. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Monica, go ahead.
I just would love to echo what Suzanne said, you know, prioritizing low-income housing, or just, you know, however rezoning can prioritize as much housing as we need to hit the necessary numbers, but the focus on low income is great. So just wanted to echo that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I see a heart from Karen. It's great. Ken, it sounded like you were gonna go ahead.
Well, I'll just say that I somehow feel that there's many, we already have many low-income people living here in Pacifica, and they should have first priority. That's about all I can think of, and they're here, and they're complaining about the lack of housing. So let's provide services to Pacificans first.
Okay, thank you. Gloria, please go ahead.
Yeah, I thoroughly agree with prioritizing very low to low income housing. Affordable housing to us now here, especially here in San Mateo County, is like out of sight for too many of us. So when we were looking at the slides earlier, it was quite astonishing, the income of certain jobs that are considered low, but definitely very low. We had a general plan and nothing was created for the low income individuals or family, and that's important. It definitely, and it should be throughout the city, be something that's prioritized throughout the city, not just located in one area. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Karen, you're raising your physical hand, which is great.
I just wanted to say, we've been talking a lot about low-income housing, and I understand the need for, like, what low-income means here is different from what it means somewhere else, but I would just like to plug for permanent supportive housing for the lowest, extremely low-income category of folks who also could use supportive services.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Bonnie, I support everybody, what they're saying about the low-income housing, and we need a lot more of it. But we have to recognize it's so expensive to build housing that we need to give density bonuses or some kind of incentive for the nonprofit and the low, or even the for-profit developers who are trying to do small units, affordable units, to come in and actually build these. Many cities have used density bonuses to incentivize the developers to do that. And the other way, we can have expedited permitting, for the building and the planning permits for that as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Anybody else? So the question again, if it brings up any other priorities, but what values or priorities should drive our rezoning decisions?
I think nobody mentioned
Bonnie, Sarah.
Oh, Remy, do you mind just holding for a second while we hear from Sarah?
Oh, great. Okay, sure. Thank you. I'll echo what everybody has been supporting about low income housing. And I think, you know, a value or a priority just in general for the rezoning is to meet the RHNA allocations and to explore various options for a whole host of different mix of housing at different income spectrums. Because I think even if we could imagine, as was even seen on the survey earlier, housing for working families, you know, again, my understanding, the more that we can be building in general ends up bringing the overall cost down. We're moving the needle forward in the direction that we need. So I just kind of wanted to add that perspective. And I think it would be wonderful to see that overall driving the rezoning while really focusing on the key categories of low income as well as for working families as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And I saw Monica throw up a heart when you were talking as well. So we'll take that as an agreement. Remy, I'm sorry for cutting you off. Please go ahead.
Sure. I think I didn't hear anybody talk about the environment, which is really important. You know, again, keeping the houses off the hillsides, off the, you know, coastal bluff is, you know, primary, you know, so they're protected from landslides, sea level rise, you know, erosion, that sort of thing. And also, I think we should incentivize, you know, green building. I know we just talked yesterday about the REACH codes, but, you know, anybody that's doing like a net zero house and putting, you know, going above and beyond with the energy conservation, solar panels, and, you know, water use reduction, you know, things like that. Again, should get, you know, incentives for, you know, adding additional units on the lot or getting, you know, some expedited permitting.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. And Gloria, I see your hand raised. While we listen to Gloria, if anybody else before this breakout group gets closed, please feel free to speak up. But Gloria, go ahead. Oh, is your hand still up from last time? Did it just never go down? You're on mute. Oh, okay, her hand's down. All right, well, anybody else? And if not, I can let the group know that we're in a good spot.
I just have a question. You mentioned some additional outreach later in October. Is there going to be more opportunity to talk about like specific programs and policies for the housing element?
Yes. So I'm sure Christian's going to go over this in the next portion after we get back together, but there's going to be 2 more meetings and it may be split in a locational to be more accommodating to the location of our residents in Pacifica, one in the north, one in the south, to talk about concepts and probably we'll get into policies then. And just kind of do the next step of what this element may look like and get your feedback. So those are set to occur hopefully by late October, fingers crossed. So, but I'm sure we'll hear more.
Thanks.
Well, I want to thank everybody for your input and being so respectful of everybody's time and comments. So that was very enjoyable.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you, Bonnie.
You're welcome. All right, here we go.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Recording in progress.
I've lost everybody.
All right. Hi, everybody. We are going to wait a second to make sure everyone comes back out on the other side of the breakout rooms. So we'll hang out here for just a moment. Elizabeth, I don't know if you're able to see, but do you have an indication if it looks like folks are back in the main group here?
Yes, all the rooms have been closed, Christian.
Great. So we hope you enjoyed that conversation. I know I certainly did in my breakout room. Welcome back again, everybody. And so I'd like to start our report out from the small group conversations with Elizabeth. So would you please just provide one or two observations from each of the three questions that the group might find of interest?
I had my listening ears on. I will do my best. I know that Paul was taking notes for our group. He can help if I miss anything. For looking to rezone, the concerns we talked about are related to the look and feel of Pacifica, homeowners concerned about how rezoning would affect their property value, how it would change the density of some areas. We spent some time talking about Sharp Park and how that could be looked at. Sorry, I'm looking through our notes. Paul, please feel free to jump in if you can summarize better than me. There was some just against new building in general, a lot of concern about not existing infrastructure to support more housing, and also environmental impacts. When it came to values and priorities, there were some environmental concerns, particularly lighting pollution, and how that should be addressed when these decisions are being made, and guarding open spaces, protecting the trees that do exist, making rules for that.
There was also, Elizabeth, I was on mute up above. There was a comment about looking at strategies for producing things like ADUs as a strategy for incrementally providing more affordable housing in a way that's natural in neighborhoods. And then on what priorities around zoning decisions, it's what you said, that people are concerned about neighborhood quality, lighting, trees, infrastructure, and thinking about the sort of the neighborhood context of zoning decisions.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, there's also mention of making sure that we have the funding to do these sorts of things. So being proactive with finding grants and other programs that might support these kind of changes. Lastly, what do you think standing in the way of housing? It was some repeat of before, but standing in the way is sort of our existing infrastructure challenges. Concern about home value in looking at this. The rules about open space in Pacifica being a limiting factor. We had some conversation about what affordable means and how that's determined and where affordable housing gets put in the city. To my group, I'm sorry if I missed some of your comments, but I think that's all I will share for our part.
No, that's great, Elizabeth. Thank you to you and to Paul. So Bonnie, why don't you go ahead and provide your report out, please? Bonnie, are you able to unmute?
Yes, I am.
Thanks. Please go ahead.
So in response to the first question, which was the concerns about rezoning, our group talked about concerns about construction occurring in the open spaces, particularly hillsides, concerns about what development in those areas would do in terms of not only construction costs, but environmental and kind of public service impacts. There was discussion of, identifying that east of Highway 1 would be a great place for density, particularly our shopping centers. There was discussion about how our rezoning could entice developers to build more low-income housing. And then we also got comments that there are no concerns, that they welcome more density, and they understand, that the commenter understands that that's a step that needs to be made to reach our goal. And so to the second question of what values or priorities should drive our rezoning discussions, I heard feedback about prioritizing low-income housing, expediting the approval process for low-income housing, even finding creating interim housing for people as we wait for low-income housing to be constructed, and then incentivizing green building, reach codes, net zero type development, and just identifying that the priority is to meet our RHNA allocations, and so housing at different incomes and for working families needs to be provided. And then to the next question of what is standing in the way of our new housing and how do we address these challenges, our group talked about cost of construction and cost of land, local opposition, the challenge that Pacifica is not a transit-oriented town, and that traffic is always a big conversation associated with development. Again, lengthy approval process for development, and there was opposite opinions of removing planning commission from the process, and then also hearing that the planning commission is an important part of that process, and the need to update the street conditions and upgrade it to support the new housing. So that's a high level summary, but hopefully I captured a little bit of everybody's input.
Thanks, Bonnie. So I will report out on my group. So as we look to rezone, what are your concerns? Some of the key feedback on that question was traffic. So there are concerns not just with Highway 1 traffic, right, which we all know about, but concerns about surface streets, particularly around school areas and the impact of various policies of the city as well as of the school district or districts on the contribution to traffic. There was discussion of ensuring the protection of hillsides in our natural open space areas and other environmentally sensitive areas, ensuring that new development is directed away from those areas. There was discussion of trying to find sites that the city owns and seeing what opportunities there may be to develop those for affordable housing, and interest in perhaps small homes and using ADUs as a strategy for meeting our RHNA. Another concern was losing the small city feel of Pacifica. And so concern about buildings that are too big or out of scale or poorly designed that don't orient to the scale and character of our community, and also buildings that don't relate to their natural connection with the beautiful environment that we have in Pacifica. With respect to what values or priorities should drive our rezoning decisions, again, the topic of natural resources and preserving the hillsides came through as a strong theme, ensuring that we don't lose the housing that we already have. And so that came up in the context of sea level rise and coastal armoring questions and concerns that not armoring the coastline might result in flooding, erosion, and destruction of tens or hundreds or even thousands of housing units potentially, and the inability for the city to really recover from that if that was a policy decision or an outcome. Additionally, needing to give more flexibility for people living here in the community about what type of growth. So having a variety of housing types as well as a geographic distribution in terms of where housing is planned and constructed. Making sure there's housing for people of all age groups, particularly young adults who feel like they're being squeezed out by housing. And then sort of moving on to what's standing in the way of housing. There were several critiques about the city's processes, acting as roadblocks and providing red tape to the housing development process. So thinking of ways to make the housing development approval process faster and more certain for housing developers. The appeal process was brought up as a key roadblock to housing development opportunities. Others wanted the ability to make sure they could come in and speak face-to-face with the city planning department staff more easily so that they could talk about their development processes or potential projects. And then another one that I thought was interesting was our community vision and trying to get past the thought that we're just a single family residential community and recognizing that to meet our arena as well as to meet people's housing needs, we need a variety of housing types. And so it was sort of a social factor to thinking about housing. So thank you again for everyone in the breakout rooms and particularly for your willingness to open up and to share your thoughts and to be open to hearing the perspectives of different people in the community. In my group, for example, we had folks who tend to align on the environmentalist and less development side of things, as well as people who are actual developers with projects pending before the city trying to get through the process. And so it was a really interesting diversity of viewpoints from my perspective. And so again, we're thankful for everyone's participation tonight. I do want to make sure you take the opportunity to email us after the meeting to tell us how we did and to share any other thoughts about this housing element update process. housing@pacifica.gov. It's a dedicated email address that the city staff monitors where we can collect information related to housing and the housing element update process. We also encourage you to visit planpacifica.org to learn more about the city's housing element update process and other planning activities. There is some information there about what went into the general plan update and the Sharp Park Pacific plan processes, for example, that you might find helpful to understand how it will relate to our upcoming sites discussions in October. Please also be sure to sign up for our mailing list. I can't emphasize that enough. You can use your phone right now on the screen to access the QR code and go to the planpacifica.org website. If that doesn't work for you, earlier we listed the text details. Elizabeth, can you perhaps read those again? I don't want to state it incorrectly, but there is an opportunity to text to sign up as well for our mailing list to make it easy for you. And also, I just want to say on behalf of the City of Pacifica, thank you again for coming, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. And before we sign off, Elizabeth, do you have the text to subscribe details handy?
Yes, I don't want to say it wrong, just like you. I do want to say while I'm looking for that, is that please, if you'd like to receive any information by snail mail, please email housing@pacifica.gov and I'm happy to add you to our mailing list. And then it is text.
There we go. Pacifica Housing to 22828. That should have been on the last slide too.
My 2s and 8s mixed up. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you again. We are so grateful to have all of you here. We look forward to seeing you in October, and stay tuned and sign up for the email list. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Elizabeth.
Our